when you manipulate. Yes, it is. And what that tells you is it's all about Goldilocks and the three bears. Too much, too little, or just the right amount. So you are recruiting automatically just the right amount of pelvic support for that task. And when someone takes your sacrum into nutation, it close packs it, right? So it's like checking strength of the knee fully locked back into extension, or the elbow fully locked out, right? And if it makes it worse, it tells you that your pelvis isn't the driver. It's basically what it tells you. So anything that moves you into more effort, less strength, poor control is the wrong way to go. So you can have people who are too stable. If their abdominal wall doesn't eccentrically relax enough, or just let go a little bit, or they're holding their floor a little bit too tight, right? Then you can brace the system too much. It can go too far that way. Absolutely. Okay, great question. Okay. All right, now, trunk rotation requires rotation of the thorax. So what I want to sort of leave you with today is this, an introduction to LJ's thoracic ring approach. And from several studies, we know that the thorax is really, really important in rotation of the trunk. Now, this is a study by Su, HSU, where they looked at the various contributions of the thorax, the lumbar spine, and by pelvis they meant hip joint. So pelvis moving on the femur, and that was considered in their eyes of the trunk. So when they talk about the trunk, it's not just stopping at the pelvis, it's including the hip. 60% of trunk rotation should come from the thorax. And when the muscles in our core, the obliques, the rectus abdominis, and the erector spinae get too tight and too toned, we lose the ability to rotate. I absolutely find no use for plank exercises, ever. If you are training somebody who is working on and being part of a human pyramid, where they're standing on the bottom and people are standing above you and you're like this, then maybe the plank is a good exercise. But most of our athletes and most things we do in life require us to move. So we need to train mobility with stability. And the problem with co-contraction bracing exercises, whether they're on gym balls or anything else, they build strength at the cost of mobility, okay? And you see it across all sports, and you see the impact of it in areas beyond it, okay? So let's have a look at some of these players, okay? And I've already pointed out this fellow who has a problem in his thorax, doesn't move his thorax very well. Across multiple videos I saw of this guy moves really well, all right? So lots of ability to dissociate his head from his thorax, from his pelvis in terms of the direction he's going, okay? Pretty good, actually. Pretty good. Not so good here. But that's kind of a funny picture to pick. Not bad. And so if we're going to understand rotation of the thorax, I want to tell you a little bit about the history of where this came from. In the early 90s, we knew very little about how the bones and joints of this thoracic ring moved. And so Jan Lowcock and I, in the early 90s, worked on a biomechanical model that was principally derived from clinical experience. And our initial questions were really biomechanical in terms of how does the thorax contribute to motion of the trunk. In multiple sports, it's really what you need to be able to do is to rotate the thorax. So each ring in the thorax has 13 joints. Okay, so there's 13 joints around the ring, which gives us 136 joints in the thorax. So even if each one only moved 1 degree, that'd still give you 136 degrees of total range of motion. Okay, so individually it may be small, but collectively it's huge. So how do they move? If you're interested in the biomechanical model, the second edition of the Thorax book has a full outline of it. The key thing that you really need to know is this, is that when we rotate, so when you go into left rotation, so just put your hands on your rib cage, sort of the lower rib cage, below your bra, right, down there. Now, rotate to the left. Actually, come up to standing for a second. Come on up to standing, because it's the same as in the pelvis. Put your hands on your nominals. Put your feet underneath your hips so that they're not really wide, but them underneath. And rotate your pelvis to the left. And can you feel your pelvis turns to the left? But in addition to that, can you feel that right innominate rotate anteriorly relative to the left one? Yep? Okay. Now, bring your hands up onto your lower ribs. Now, angle your fingers down on the front. Your rib cage is not like this. The front of the ribs are lower than the back. and rotate to the left. And back. And to the left again. It's exactly the same. The rib on the right should anteriorly rotate. The rib on the left should posteriorly rotate. Now, if you lie the flat of your hand along the side of your rib cage, so like I'm doing now, and imagine that there's an axis going from your head right through your pelvic floor between your feet. So don't shift sideways as you turn, but just turn around that axis. What you'll also feel is that there's a small amount of lateral translation that also occurs. You'll feel some push of the ribs into your right hand. Okay? But not if you do that, because then you're running away. Okay? So there. You feel that? All right. So there's a small amount of lateral translation. So we call this the ring dance. So if you put your arms out like this, so your arms are left and right ribs, and your trunk is the vertebrae in between. So now, if you turn your head to the left and lift your left arm up, externally rotate that arm, that is what happens in left rotation. So the left rib posteriorly rotates, the right rib anteriorly rotates, and then all you need to do is slide off to the right. So this is the ring dance. Try teaching this in Japanese with translation. That's where this came from. I just couldn't do it. Okay, so that's what the rib cage does when it dances. Okay, have a seat. Now, in order for that to happen, it needs space. If you have these rings that are all stacked together and compressed by high tone, tight back muscles, tight chest muscles, strong core, you've planked it to death. Boom. You've done this. You've made it powerfully stable. According to Stuart McGill, this is the most stable you can be, because his definition of stability is don't buckle. So if we pack it all together like that, and then you compress it even more, it's not going to go anywhere. But you're for sure going to compress your discs, for sure you're going to trash your back, and you're not going to kick a ball very well, right? So he treats powerlifters, so it makes sense what they do. If you're going to lift a bar, that makes sense. But this can't spin. What you need in order to spin and to rotate is we need space. We need to be able to eccentrically lengthen the lats, the pecs, the obliques, to create a space between the rings so that they can start to rotate, okay? And so the thoracic ring approach sort of came from LJ's personal experience of car accident and hitting hockey into her thorax, created instability in her back, and the things that she had to do to try and get functional again. She's developed a series of novel tests in this approach that pertain to assessing the thorax as a complete functional unit, which is that intact ring. She also identified these ring shifts that weren't just based on articular reasons. So back in the biomechanical model, it was very much about the joint. That if the joint's not moving, we'll manipulate it, and we'll manipulate the ring and restore its function. So very manual therapy-based driven when the whole thing started. And this approach is very much more about considering motor control. So in 1996, I published an article in the Manual Therapy Journal where I really thought, when we had a restriction, when we felt this ring sitting off to the side, and it wouldn't go back in, so to speak, we couldn't get it to correct, what we would do is we would manipulate this segment, just lay them down and crack them, manipulate them, sit them back up, and the rotation would come back. And those are probably in the days when you and I were working together, right? And we originally thought that this was an underlying articular fixation, that it was an articular problem. But, and the translation was going in the wrong direction. However, what LJ sorted out was that, okay, so here's a ring which is translating to the left. It's sticking out to the left, and it's not translating to the right when this gal turns. If she stacks this, if she corrects this and stacks it, she gets a huge improvement, a huge increase in the rotation, okay? And it makes sense. If you've got a ring that is sitting off to the left, because of, say, for example, this iliocostalis is pulling down on the right. When you turn to the left, if this part of your back doesn't completely relax and lengthen to allow space for that ring to go the other way, that holds it this way, you're only going to rotate as far as that stuck rib. And then you're going to start to shear, you'll shift your center of mass off your base of support, you're going to leave your thorax behind, it's not going to line up, it's not going to stack up correctly, okay? So if you can correct these things with your hands, with a little bit of traction and a little bit of correction, can this be a stiff, stuck joint? No. Stiff, stuck joints, you won't be able to change. You won't get this finding. You won't get this effect, this change, when you, in somebody that has a neuromuscular control problem or has an articular problem. If they have an articular problem, it won't change. So they're still there, but they're just not as common as we used to think they are. And why our manipulation techniques in the thorax are effective for so many conditions is because manipulation techniques are neurophysiological. They're not just about, I have a stiff joint, I'm going to manipulate it free. They reboot, they rewire the system, but there's no learning in a manipulation technique. You manipulate something, it's temporary. Now we have to rewire the brain map to teach them how to move in a different way. So she took her clinical questions, as I mentioned earlier, into the research setting and has developed a PhD around it. Now, let's look at a couple of these. All right, so this is the fellow I pointed out earlier who seems to me to have lovely thoracic rotation and basically uses his thorax well. And here's our friend who moves his trunk like a box. So there's a bit of rotation here, but in essence, he moves his pelvis and his thorax as a unit. Yeah, does this huge risk for having leg problems between having this, the ability to dissociate the pelvis from your thorax, thorax from your pelvis, versus moving it like a box. So if you're reviewing some of the video from game footage, and I really, really encourage you to start to look at some of the natural patterns of how these guys are moving, and see if you can start to help them be a little bit better. Okay, so I'm going to actually take you through this seated trunk rotation so that you can feel a little bit about this, and then I'm going to I'll demonstrate some of this on Rick in terms of how it relates to the one-legged standing task. Okay, and then we'll be done. So let's go back into the other room and we'll see if I can walk you through feeling some.